What is sin and where is it located? Or, if you like, where does evil come from? This is one of the questions all Christians and Christian groups must answer, either explicitly or implicitly. And because it is such a central question, it is one of the things H. Richard Niebuhr uses to distinguish between different Christian groups with regard to how they answer the Christ culture question. Today, we'll take a look at how the Christ of culture group typically answers this question. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Tuesday, July 2nd, 2024. So what is sin? Where does evil come from? Not every Christian, but every human being has to confront this question simply because evil is an obvious part of life in the world. Why do people commit crimes and harm one another? Why does God even allow these things to happen in the first place? Either God isn't loving and just, or else God isn't powerful enough to prevent it. That's the usual protest about the ugly fact that evil exists and is apparently allowed to exist in God's creation. What we found with the Christ against culture type is that sin is seen, not surprisingly, as a problem within culture. They typically understand the community of faith as exempt from the effects of sin. It is the flawed and corrupt values of culture, any and every kind of culture, that produces sin. But because the community of faith has withdrawn from the world and as completely as possible, the community of faith is therefore immune from the insidious effects of culture and its corrupted values. At least that's what that group thinks. Not surprisingly, the Christ of culture type sees things very differently. Sin is not a problem of culture generally, but only within certain parts of culture, specifically those parts that are unenlightened, that do not share in the enlightened mind. Evil exists for these folks because some people resist the ennobling effects of right thinking. If there is a flaw in the Christ of culture mindset, it is that it begins to resemble the ancient Gnostic heresy, the belief that only certain people who possess secret and higher knowledge can free themselves from the insidious effects of sin and evil. To put it in other terms, whereas the Christ against culture type sees sin as radical but not universal, the Christ of culture type sees sin as universal but not radical. What I mean by this is that sin can be seen as either universal, that is, shared by all, or sin can be seen as radical, that is, cutting to the very core of human life and human nature. Most Christianity understands sin to be both radical, as being a core feature of human nature, and as universal, as applying to all persons. But the against culture types believe that sin does not apply to them, but to those who belong to the world. It cuts to the very core of their being. The of culture type, on the other hand, sees sin as universal. We are all alike affected by it, but sin can also be overcome by human effort. It is therefore not radical. It does not reside at the very core of human nature. This is the great divide between these two types, and it distinguishes them from each other almost as completely as their understanding of Scripture and its place in coming to the knowledge of God. Ironically, one of the ways this plays itself out in the of culture type is in a legalism nearly as strict as the against culture type. After all, if we can free ourselves from sin's insidious effects by our own human striving and by adhering to the right knowledge of the enlightened mind, then it leaves little excuse for failure to live up to the high ideals of that enlightened mind. The of culture type, like some of the rest of Niebuhr's types, aims to reform the world, to heal the wounds caused by the insidious influence of sin, that it creates a sort of stringent legalism that defines what the enlightened mind should and should not do. And this plays itself out across the theological spectrum. One of the things I hinted at yesterday, but need to emphasize more fully today, is that the against culture type and the of culture types are not at the opposite ends of the left-right spectrum. Indeed, some against culture types are folks we would see as radical liberals, and some of the of-culture folks we would see as red-blooded conservatives, and vice versa. No, what distinguishes these two types is not where they happen to land on the liberal-conservative spectrum, but the different ways they understand culture, and the different ways that they interpret sin, and which legalisms they must follow. For the of-culture type, it is all about gaining access to a more enlightened knowledge of what it means to live a good and virtuous life. The actual understanding of what this looks like can differ widely. For those on the left, it's about social justice. For those on the right, it's all about holiness. But in both cases, it is about perfecting the culture, restoring it to an idealized version of what culture should look like. The particulars may differ, but the underlying dynamics are the same. Tomorrow, we'll begin our look at the third of Niebuhr's types, what he calls the Christ above culture. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.